I never should have taken the night shift at Evergreen Sleep Clinic. What I witnessed there still haunts my dreams. Dozens of patients, moving in perfect unison, their eyes vacant, yet somehow focused directly on me. But I should start from the beginning, before everything went wrong. I am Dr. Sarah Chen, and I've spent the last decade studying sleep disorders. When I got the offer to head up research at Evergreen, it seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. The facility was state-of-the-art, the funding was excellent, and the chance to study severe cases of parasomnia was too good to pass up. If only I'd known what was really happening in those pristine white halls. If only I'd noticed the signs earlier. Maybe then my colleagues would still be alive. Maybe then I wouldn't wake up screaming every night, remembering those hollow eyes and synchronized footsteps. This is my warning to anyone who might stumble across similar patterns. Because what we discovered at Evergreen wasn't just a sleep disorder. It was something far more sinister. Something that defied everything we know about human consciousness. The first few weeks at Evergreen were completely normal. We had 24 patients, all with varying degrees of sleepwalking disorders. Some would simply sit up in bed, others would wander the halls, and a few would try to perform complex tasks while completely unconscious. We had all the standard safety protocols in place: locked doors, padded walls, 24-hour surveillance. I spent my days reviewing sleep studies and my nights monitoring the ward. The patients were in diverse group: a school teacher with night terrors, a construction worker who sleep ate, a teenager who could solve complex math problems while unconscious. But they all had one thing in common: their episodes were getting worse, not better, despite our treatments. I started noticing small oddities. Patients who had never synchronized before would get up at exactly the same time. They'd walk the same paths, mirror each other's movements. At first, I convinced myself it was just coincidence. After all, synchronous behavior isn't unheard of in sleep studies. Everything changed on night 37 of my research. I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something strange on the monitors. Every single patient was sitting upright in bed, facing the same direction. Not just approximately the same direction, exactly the same angle, down to the degree. I checked the time, 3:33 a.m. As I watched, they all turned their heads simultaneously to face their respective doors. No one had ever documented this kind of precise synchronization in sleepwalkers before. I frantically started recording everything, checking vital signs, brainwave patterns. The data was extraordinary. Their brain activity was identical, moving in perfect waves like some kind of shared consciousness. I should have reported it immediately, but my scientific curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to understand what was happening. That decision would cost us dearly, because while I was focused on gathering data, I missed something crucial. They weren't just moving in sync, they were practicing. Over the next few nights, the synchronized behavior became more complex. The patients would rise from their beds at exactly 3:33 a.m., walk to their doors, and stand there, waiting. The night staff started getting nervous. Some claimed they could hear whispers coming from the rooms, but when they checked, all the patients were silent. Others swore they saw shadows moving against the laws of physics. I dismissed these reports as sleep-deprived imaginations. Then one night, I saw it myself. I was watching the monitors when every single patient turned to face their respective cameras. 24 pairs of wide-open eyes, all staring directly into the lenses. But that wasn't what terrified me. It was the fact that under the vacant expressions, I could see something else, something intelligent and calculating. And then, as one, they all smiled. Not normal smiles. These were wide, unnatural grins that stretched far beyond what should have been physically possible. I spent days analyzing the footage, looking for any explanation. The patients were from different backgrounds, had different conditions, different medications. There was no logical reason for this level of synchronization. But as I dug deeper, I found something disturbing. Before coming to Evergreen, none of these patients had any history of sleepwalking. Their symptoms had all started within weeks of admission, and they all reported the same dream, a vast, dark space filled with whispers. I started tracking their movements, creating maps of their nightly patterns. When I overlaid the paths they took during their synchronized walks, they formed perfect geometric shapes: pentagrams, hexagons, spirals, complex patterns that couldn't possibly be random. But it was when I played the surveillance footage backward that I discovered the most chilling detail. Hidden in their movements was a message, repeated over and over: "We are coming." Last night, everything culminated in a way I never could have predicted. At 3:33 a.m., every patient walked out of their rooms simultaneously. The electronic locks had all failed at exactly the same moment. They moved in perfect formation, like a military unit, down the hallways. When security tried to intervene, the patients didn't even slow down. They just walked through them, literally through them, as if the guards were made of smoke. The temperature in the building plummeted. Lights flickered and died. And still they came, their footsteps echoing in perfect rhythm. I watched in horror from the security room as they surrounded my office. They stood there, 24 pairs of eyes staring at the camera, unblinking. And then they spoke, not individually, but as one voice, layered and distorted. "Doctor," they said, "thank you for gathering us. We've been waiting so long." What happened next still doesn't feel real. The patients began to change. Their bodies stretched and contorted, growing taller, their limbs elongating like shadows at sunset. Their faces. I can't even describe what happened to their faces, but suddenly I understood. These weren't my patients anymore. Maybe they never had been. We hadn't been studying them. They had been studying us, using our facility, our research, our desperate desire to understand sleep disorders to gather strength. Each synchronized movement had been a test, each pattern a piece of some larger ritual. And now, after 37 nights, they were ready. The thing wearing my patients' faces told me the truth, about the ancient entities that exist in the spaces between sleep and wakefulness, about their plans for our world, about how they'd been searching for centuries for the right combination of dreamers to serve as their vessels. I managed to escape that night, but not before witnessing things that defy explanation. The entire facility is gone now, not destroyed, just gone, as if it never existed. The official report says it was a gas leak, an explosion, a tragic accident, but I know the truth. I know they're still out there, wearing the faces of my patients, walking among us, and they're looking for more dreamers. That's why I am sharing this story. If you notice someone walking in their sleep, moving with impossible precision, their eyes open but empty, run. If you start seeing patterns in the movements of strangers, geometric shapes formed by their paths, look away. And if you ever hear whispers at 3:33 a.m., telling you to wake up and walk, whatever you do, keep your eyes closed. Because they're spreading, gathering dreamers one by one. And next time, they won't need a sleep clinic to find their vessels. The clock struck midnight as I stepped into the dimly lit hotel lobby. My new job as the night receptionist felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life. But something about the air that night felt wrong. The manager, Mr. Harlow, gave me a rushed briefing, his eyes darting nervously. "Keep the doors locked after 11 p.m., he muttered, avoiding my gaze. "And if you hear anything strange, don't go investigating." His words sounded absurd, almost laughable, until I saw the missing persons posters pinned to the staff room wall. All women, all last seen near this very hotel. A shiver ran down my spine as I forced a smile and took my seat behind the desk. The lobby was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears strain for non-existent sounds. I scanned the CCTV monitors out of boredom, but my heart sank when I noticed a shadow dart past one of the hallway cameras. At first, I thought it was a glitch, but when the motion sensor lights flickered on, panic gripped me. Someone was out there, lurking just beyond my line of sight. An hour passed uneventfully, but the unease refused to fade. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. My phone vibrated with a message from Mr. Harlow. "Do not leave the desk." I stared at the screen, confused and annoyed. Was this some kind of initiation prank? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of faint knocking. It came from the side door near the staff room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just 3 more knocks, deliberate and slow. Against my better judgment, I approached the door. Through the small glass window, I saw a woman in a tattered dress, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Please help me," she whispered, barely audible. My hand hovered over the lock, but something about her eyes stopped me. They weren't pleading, they were lifeless. A guttural scream erupted from her as she slammed her hands against the glass. I stumbled back, heart racing, and when I looked again, she was gone. Only her smeared handprints remained. I rushed back to the desk, realizing Mr. Harlow's warning wasn't a joke. My nerves were frayed, but the night was far from over. As I watched the CCTV monitors, I noticed movement in the hallway on the second floor. A tall man wearing a dark hoodie stood motionless outside room 212. He wasn't a guest. I had checked the registry twice. Grabbing the phone, I dialed Mr. Harlow. It rang endlessly before going to voicemail. Desperate, I picked up the intercom and announced, "Security check on the second floor. Please stay in your rooms." My voice cracked mid-sentence. The man on the screen turned his head sharply, as if he'd heard me. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He waved at the camera. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was slow, deliberate, mocking. I slammed the monitor off, my chest heaving. Moments later, the elevator dinged. My stomach dropped as I realized it was coming down to the lobby. The doors opened to reveal an empty cabin, but the faint scent of iron wafted out, making me gag. I locked the lobby doors and prayed for morning to come. The hours dragged on, each second a cruel taunt. Just as I began to think the worst was over, a piercing scream shattered the silence. It came from the second floor. I froze, debating whether to call the police, but my trembling hands betrayed me. The sound of rapid footsteps followed, growing louder, closer. Suddenly, the emergency phone rang. "Help me!" a woman's voice shrieked. "He's here!" Before I could respond, the line went dead. Heart pounding, I checked the monitors. Room 212's door was ajar, and a crimson stain pooled outside it. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept upstairs armed with nothing but a flashlight. The hallway was deserted, but the stench of blood was overwhelming. I peeked into room 212. The bed was unmade, the sheets soaked in red. A single high heel lay abandoned on the floor. Panic set in as I realized there was no body. Just then, I heard heavy breathing behind me. Spinning around, my flashlight illuminated the man from the cameras. His twisted smile revealed yellowed teeth. "You are not supposed to be here," he growled, lunging toward me. I bolted down the hallway, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The man's footsteps thundered behind me, growing louder with each passing second. My only thought was to get back to the lobby, where the locks might buy me some time. Reaching the stairwell, I flung the door open and sprinted down, nearly tripping over my own feet. My lungs burned, my vision blurred, but I couldn't stop. Not until I reached the front desk. Slamming the door shut behind me, I scrambled to lock it. The pounding on the other side was relentless. "Open up!" he shouted, his voice dripping with malice. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, barely managing to explain the situation through my gasps for air. The operator assured me help was on the way, but their calm tone felt disconnected from the terror I was living. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. A chilling whisper drifted through the door. "I'll see you soon." My blood turned to ice. The silence that followed was deafening, a void filled with dread. Red and blue lights bathed the lobby as the police finally arrived. I flung the door open, relief flooding over me. Two officers entered cautiously, their hands on their holstered weapons. "We'll check the building," one said, motioning for me to stay put. I watched the monitors as they moved through the hallways, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Everything seemed clear until they reached room 212. The officers froze, their radios crackling with static. One of them muttered, "Oh my God," before the feed cut out entirely. Panic surged as I shouted into the intercom, but there was no response. Minutes felt like hours before they returned, their faces pale. "We found something," one of them said hesitantly, "but here is no sign of your attacker." They handed me a bloodied necklace, the same one the woman in the tattered dress had worn. My stomach churned as I realized she hadn't been a victim. She had been his accomplice. The officers promised to stay until morning, but their presence did little to ease my growing paranoia. Morning finally broke, painting the hotel in pale light. Exhausted but alive, I packed my things, determined never to return. As I stepped outside, the crisp air felt like a reprieve. One of the officers approached me. "We'll be in touch if we find anything," he said, handing me his card. I nodded, eager to leave the nightmare behind. But as I walked to my car, something caught my eye. A man sitting on a bench across the street. He was wearing a dark hoodie. Our eyes met, and my heart sank. It was him. The same twisted smile played on his lips. I fumbled for my keys, but when I looked up again, he was gone. The realization hit me like a freight train. He knew where I lived, The bloodied necklace, the deliberate taunts, they weren't warnings. They were promises. As I drove away, every shadow on the road felt like his. The safety I thought I'd found was an illusion, shattered by the knowledge that this nightmare was far from over. I've since moved across the country, changed my name and tried to forget, but the scars of that night run deep. Every creak in my new home, every stranger's glance sends my heart racing. I've stopped sleeping through the night, haunted by the memories and the fear that he's still out there, watching. The police investigation led nowhere. No arrests, no closure, just a cold case file gathering dust. But I know the truth, he's still hunting. Sometimes, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I hear his voice outside my window. Other nights, I dream of the hotel, of the blood-stained hallway and the woman's lifeless eyes. I've shared my story not to seek sympathy, but to warn others. Evil doesn't just disappear, it lingers, waiting for the right moment to strike again. So if you are ever working the night shift and feel like someone's watching, trust your instincts. Lock the doors, stay vigilant, and never, ever ignore the shadows. Because once you let them in, they may never leave. It was a routine night shift, or so I thought. The office was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a gunshot. My desk lamp flickered ominously, and the dull hum of the air conditioning was the only sound. Then, the scream shattered everything. It wasn't a cry for help, it was raw, guttural, and filled with despair. I froze, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. My heart raced as the scream echoed through the empty halls. Moments later, the lights in the building dimmed, plunging my floor into near darkness. I knew something was terribly wrong. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and walked toward the source of the sound, the elevator. As the doors slid open, a sickening metallic scent hit me. My stomach churned. Inside, faint bloody handprints streaked the walls, leading down to the basement level. I hesitated but stepped into the elevator. The journey down felt endless, the air growing colder with each passing second. When the doors finally opened, the scene before me froze me in place. The basement was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows. Papers were scattered everywhere, and a desk chair lay toppled over. A trail of blood led down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but something compelled me forward, strange mix of curiosity and dread. As I followed the trail, the eerie hum of the building faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. Suddenly, I heard faint, choking sobs. They were coming from behind a storage room door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a man sitting on the floor. His back was to me, and he was rocking back and forth, muttering incoherently. My breath caught when he turned to face me. It was Henry, a worker I barely knew but often saw in the break room. His face was pale, eyes hollow and red. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. His hands were stained with blood, though I couldn't see any wounds on him. "Henry, what happened?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't answer but motioned toward the far corner of the room. There, I saw a blood-streaked security badge, its lanyard twisted and frayed. Henry's muttering grew louder, his words blending into a nonsensical chant. "They don't care. They never cared. Now they'll see." His voice cracked, and tears streamed down his face. I wanted to help him, but an overwhelming sense of danger kept me rooted to the spot. Henry's rambling turned into loud, almost feral laughter. He pointed to the badge. "It's all their fault," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "They pushed me too far." He explained how he had been overworked, ridiculed, and ignored by the company. His voice cracked as he spoke about endless deadlines and sleepless nights. But then his tone shifted. "I warned them. They thought I was bluffing." My stomach dropped as I realized what he meant. Henry had snuck past security and triggered an emergency lock. He wanted them to find him here, surrounded by the evidence of his suffering. But it wasn't just about revenge, it was about sending a message. His final act would be seared into the minds of everyone who ignored his cries for help. The weight of his despair hit me like a tidal wave. Suddenly, Henry stood up, clutching something in his hand, a thick shard of broken glass. "No one listened," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Maybe now they'll hear me." My heart pounded as I tried to reason with him. "Henry, please, we can fix this. Let's talk to someone." But my words didn't reach him. He stepped toward me, his face twisted in anguish. "You don't understand," he said. "It's too late." Before I could stop him, he raised the shard to his neck. "Henry, no," I screamed, lunging forward. But I was too late. Blood spilled onto the cold floor as he collapsed. The silence that followed was deafening. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. My hands shook as I dialed security, my voice cracking as I explained what had happened. Moments later, the basement filled with the sound of heavy boots and walkie-talkies. The security team stormed in, their faces pale as they took in the scene. They asked me endless questions, but I could barely form coherent answers. All I could do was replay Henry's final words in my head. "Maybe now they'll hear me." The paramedics arrived, but it was too late. Henry was gone. His lifeless body was carried out, leaving behind a chilling emptiness. The next morning, the company sent out an email addressing the incident. They called it a tragedy and offered counseling services to employees. But the tone was cold, clinical, lacking the humanity Henry desperately needed. Whispers filled the office as co-workers speculated about what happened. Some blamed Henry for his actions, while others pointed fingers at the company's toxic environment. I couldn't shake the guilt. Could I have done something to prevent this? His face haunted me, especially his final, heart-wrenching words. I started digging into his life, reading old emails and reports. What I found painted a grim picture: countless ignored complaints and pleas for support. Henry wasn't just a man who broke. He was a warning sign we all ignored. Weeks passed, but the memory of that night refused to fade. I began having nightmares, visions of Henry's hollow eyes and blood-stained hands. The office felt different, colder. His desk remained untouched, a grim reminder of what had happened. I realized Henry's story was more than a tragedy. It was a reflection of something deeply wrong in our system. We're all so consumed by deadlines and quotas that we forget the people behind them. I decided to share his story, hoping it would make others think twice about how they treat their coworkers. But even as I recount this, I can't escape the guilt. Every creak in the office reminds me of him, every flicker of the lights. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear his voice whispering from the basement. They don't care. They never cared. "911, what's your emergency?" Silence. Just the faint crackle of static on the line. "Hello? This is emergency services. Do you need help?" More silence. Then a sound that made my skin crawl. Slow, deliberate breathing. I'd been a 911 operator for 7 years, and something about this call felt different, wrong. I checked the caller ID, 1879 Maple Street. A quick search in our system showed the property was vacant, had been for 3 years since the previous owners died in a house fire. If someone is there and cannot speak, press any button on your phone. Nothing. Just that breathing, getting heavier, closer to the receiver. Then a whisper, so quiet I almost missed it. "Help, they're coming back." The line went dead. I tried to shake it off. Wrong numbers, pranks, and glitches happened all the time. But something about that whisper, the raw terror in those 3 words, made my hands shake as I logged the call. Little did I know this was just the beginning of my nightmare. Every night after that, exactly at 3:27 a.m., the calls came from the same number, same address, same breathing. I requested patrol cars to check the property multiple times. Each report came back the same. House secure, no signs of entry, thick dust undisturbed on the windowsills. The landline had been disconnected years ago, but the calls kept coming. Sometimes there was just breathing, sometimes whispers in what sounded like multiple voices, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. Once, I heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across hardwood floors, followed by a child's laughter. I started dreading the graveyard shift. My colleagues thought I was losing it. They'd answer calls from the same address during their shifts, but they'd hear nothing, just dial tone. The house only called for me. I tried switching shifts, but the calls followed my schedule. If I worked at 2 p.m., the call came at 2:27. If I worked evenings, 9:27, always exactly 27 minutes into my shift. I couldn't take it anymore. On my day off, I drove to 1879 Maple Street. The house stood like a dark wound in the cheerful suburban street, windows boarded, paint peeling, yellow police tape still clinging to the porch railings. I talked to neighbors. They shared disturbing stories about the family who died there. The parents had been acting strange in the weeks before the fire. The children had stopped going to school. Strange noises came from the house at night. The fire department's report listed the cause as undetermined. But the retired firefighter I tracked down told me something different. The bodies they found weren't burned. They were already dead before the fire, positioned in a circle in the basement, surrounded by strange symbols drawn in something dark. That night at work, the call came right on schedule. But this time when I answered, a child's voice sang, "We know you visited today. When are you coming inside to play?" I nearly quit right then. The calls evolved. They became clearer, more coherent, more terrifying. "The shadows are hungry," they'd whisper. "They ate mommy and daddy, but we're still here, playing, waiting." Sometimes they'd recite my private conversations from earlier that day, things they couldn't possibly know. One night, the voice described exactly what I was wearing, down to the small coffee stain on my sleeve I hadn't noticed before. Then it started describing what I'd been doing at home, alone, before my shift. They were watching me. I installed security cameras at my house. They showed nothing unusual, but every morning I'd wake up to find tiny handprints in the dust on my mirrors. Children's handprints. My coworkers suggested therapy. My supervisor offered medical leave. But I knew what I was experiencing was real. The voices were getting stronger, more demanding, and they kept saying the same thing. "You have to come. You have to help us finish the game." Last night, everything changed. The call came as usual, but instead of voices, I heard screaming. Not the normal kind. These screams seemed to come from somewhere deep, somewhere wrong. Then sudden silence, followed by a new voice. Adult, male, heavy with menace. "You've kept us waiting long enough," it growled. "The children miss you. The shadows miss you. Come home." "This isn't my home," I said, finally breaking protocol by engaging. "Stop calling me. The laugh that followed will haunt me forever." "Check your doorstep," it said. After my shift, I found a package wrapped in burnt newspaper. Inside was a child's drawing done in red crayon. Stick figures in a circle, one adult figure in the middle. My name was written beneath it. The paper was dated 1987, the same year I was born. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I dug deeper into the house's history, going back decades before the fire. What I found changed everything. Every 20 years a family would die there. Always the same pattern: parents acting strange, children disappearing, bodies found in the basement. But here is what broke me. In every case, there was a 911 operator who reported strange calls before each death. Each operator disappeared shortly after investigating. The most recent was my mother. She vanished while pregnant with me, but they only found 4 bodies in the basement after that fire. Not 5. I was born the same day she disappeared. Today, I found her old case files. The symbols in the basement, they weren't drawn in blood or paint. They were drawn in ash. Ash from the previous victims. I am recording this now because I know what I have to do. The calls won't stop until I go back there. Back home. Last night's call was different. I heard my mother's voice for the first time. "You were born in the shadow, baby. The circle must be completed." I understand now. I wasn't just receiving their calls. I was always meant to answer them. By the time you hear this, I'll be at 1879 Maple Street. The front door will be unlocked, as it has been every night, waiting for me. Don't try to find me. Don't try to save me. Just listen for the phone calls. They'll start again in 20 years. And when they do, pray you are not the one who answers. It was a quiet night in the hospital. One of those eerie silences that made the ticking clock on the wall feel deafening. I was on the night shift with my colleague Emily. We'd barely spoken, each of us preoccupied with our rounds. Then, it happened. The phone at the nurse's station rang sharply, cutting through the silence like a knife. That phone rarely rang. Especially at 2 a.m. I answered, expecting a routine query. But the voice on the other end was nothing I could have prepared for. "Help me," a faint, trembling voice whispered. My stomach tightened as I strained to hear more. "Room 208, they added, their words barely audible before the line went dead. My heart dropped. Room 208 had been vacant for months. No patients, no equipment, nothing. And to make it worse, there wasn't even a phone in that room. I exchanged a glance with Emily, her face mirroring my dread. "Maybe it's a prank," she suggested, but her tone betrayed her doubt. Pranks didn't feel this wrong. With hesitation tightening my chest, we grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. The hallway leading to room 208 felt longer than usual, the dim lighting casting exaggerated shadows on the walls. Each step echoed ominously, amplifying my growing unease. Emily clutched my arm as we approached the door. It was closed but not locked. Pushing it open, the room was just as empty as it had been during our last inspection. A barren bed, unused machines, and a faint smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. But something was off. The air felt heavy, as though the room was holding its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The silence that followed was unnerving, thick with tension. Emily scanned the room with her flashlight, and for a moment, I almost believed we were imagining things. But then we saw it. On the bed, the crisp white sheets were rumpled, as though someone had been lying there moments ago. Worse, there was a faint indentation on the pillow, a perfect outline of a head. Emily gasped, backing toward the door. "This isn't funny," she whispered. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the bed, certain that something unseen was watching us. As we turned to leave, the overhead lights flickered erratically, plunging the room into brief bouts of darkness. That's when the sound started, a low, crackling static, like a detuned radio, emanating from nowhere. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. Emily nodded, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The sound seemed to come from every corner of the room, growing louder and more distorted with each passing second. Then, the shadows began to shift. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but Emily saw it too. Dark, unsteady shapes slid across the walls, moving independently of the light. One shadow lingered near the bed, its outline vaguely human. "Let's go," Emily stammered, tugging at my sleeve. But I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the shadow by the bed. It wasn't just moving, it was reaching out, its form stretching unnaturally toward us. Suddenly, the static cut off, leaving the room deathly silent. But the shadow remained, looming and motionless. It was enough to snap me back to reality. Grabbing Emily, we bolted from the room, our breaths ragged and hearts racing. Back at the nurse's station, we tried to make sense of what had just happened. Emily's hands shook as she fumbled with her phone. "We need to check the security footage," she said, her voice trembling. Pulling up the live feed, we rewound to the moment we entered room 208. The footage showed us walking in, just as we remembered. But what happened next froze us in place. The video showed the bed's sheets rumpling and the pillow sinking as if someone invisible was lying there. Then, the shadow appeared. It slid across the walls, its movements more deliberate and menacing than I had realized in the moment. But what chilled me to my core was the moment we fled the room. As we exited, the shadow turned, its indistinct head following us to the door. It lingered there, standing still before vanishing entirely. "If here is no way this is real," Emily muttered, tears welling in her eyes. But the evidence was right there, impossible to deny. And it left us with one horrifying question: if that wasn't a prank, then what was it? Just as we began to process what we'd seen, the phone rang again. Emily screamed, and I jumped, my heart pounding in my ears. Hesitating, I picked up the receiver. "Why did you leave?" the same faint voice whispered. My blood ran cold. This time the voice was clearer, more desperate. "Come back, please." I slammed the phone down, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Emily stared at me, her face pale. "Was it them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. The phone sat there, silent and unassuming, as though nothing had happened. But we knew better. Whatever it wasn't done with us. "Should we tell someone?" Emily asked. But deep down, we both knew no one would believe us. Taking a deep breath, I decided to check the patient records. Maybe there was an explanation, something we'd missed. The log for room 208 was blank, except for one entry from years ago. A patient had died there under mysterious circumstances. The cause of death? Unknown. The more we dug into the history of room 208, the darker the story became. It turned out that several nurses had reported strange occurrences there over the years: phantom footsteps, disembodied voices, and unexplained cold spots. One nurse had even quit after seeing the shadowy figure hovering near the bed, the same one we'd witnessed. But none of this was ever officially documented. It was just chalked up to superstition, and overactive imaginations. Emily and I decided to stay out of the room for the rest of the night, but the events wouldn't leave my mind. Every creak, every faint noise in the hallway felt like an omen. The hospital, once a place of healing, now felt like a trap. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. But one thing was certain: I would never set foot in room 208 again. Before I left, I glanced at the phone one last time. It was quiet now, as if mocking me for my fear. But deep down, I knew it was just waiting. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal, at least on the surface. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, one night, I got another call. This time, it wasn't from the hospital, it was on my personal phone. The number was unlisted. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Why did you leave me?" The voice was the same, but now it was angry, distorted, and echoing, as if it were coming from a deep, dark place. I froze, my blood turning to ice. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The line crackled, and the voice replied, "You know who I am." Then the call ended. I haven't worked another night shift since. The hospital staff says room 208 remains empty, but I know better. That room isn't empty, it never was. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear that voice in my dreams, calling me back. I just hope I never answer.